This is Petty Wap coming to you live from Park Hills, Missouri, with your first video from the Judicial Branch unit. This unit covers chapters 11 and 12 and is your last major unit of the year. So let's get started. The Judicial Branch is comprised at the federal level of the Supreme Court, but also a variety of other federal courts that we will talk about in detail. So before we get started on the Supreme Court, we first want to look at jurisdiction. Now, we've talked about this term jurisdiction before, and this is some of your vocabulary terms. Original jurisdiction refers to the first time a case is heard. Appellate jurisdiction refers to the second time or like any subsequent times that the case is heard. And concurrent jurisdiction refers to those cases that the federal court system and the state court systems can hear, those overlapping jurisdictions. Moving on then, federal court jurisdiction. The federal court has the authority to hear a case if it involves two or more state governments. So for example, if the state of Missouri sued the state of Illinois over control of the Mississippi River, that would be something that would be heard in the federal court system and not in one of the state court systems because of the obvious bias. Federal courts can also hear cases dealing with citizens who are residents of different states. If you're a resident of a state and you're suing someone who lives in a different state, obviously those state courts cannot hear those decisions, again, because of bias. And then also dealing with citizens of the same state who claim the same land. That really doesn't happen much anymore. This was an issue when our country was first established, but not really the case anymore. And another thing I want to highlight before we move on is the importance of the 14th Amendment. Now, we've talked about the 14th Amendment a lot in this class, but just to make sure that you remember the basics about it. The 14th Amendment is one of the Reconstruction Amendments, and it established citizenship requirements. So you are a citizen of the United States if you are born or naturalized in the United States. Now, the original intent of the 14th Amendment was to provide newly freed slaves with citizenship rights, but it has been applied in different contexts later on. So citizenship is given at birth in America. So if you are born in America, then you are a citizen. If you're born in one of our territories or on one of our military bases, then you are a citizen of the United States. If you are born outside of the country and one or both of your parents has American citizenship, then you have American citizenship. The 14th Amendment also includes the Due Process Clause, which basically means that if you are a citizen of the United States, you're not going to be treated differently based on like your race or your gender or your religion or anything like that. And the incorporation of the 14th Amendment is also very important. When we're talking about incorporation, we're talking about that the states had to also abide by the 14th Amendment, not just the federal level. So the 14th Amendment, its incorporation allowed states to exercise and to recognize rights that were granted in the Constitution. So scooting on then to the Supreme Court, and this is part one of two Supreme Court sections that you're going to have. So the Supreme Court obviously hears all cases in Washington, D.C. Now, I say obviously because that's kind of a given now. The Supreme Court isn't going to travel from place to place to hear cases. It used to do that. Years ago, the Supreme Court used to do something called riding the circuit, where they were literally, a Supreme Court justice would go to different towns and hear cases. They don't do that anymore. The Supreme Court currently includes 9 justices. There are 8 justices, and then, or we call them associate justices, and then 1 chief justice. So the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. The jurisdiction of the Supreme Court is kind of a gray area. They have original jurisdiction in cases that involve foreign governments. So if a representative from a foreign government did something wrong in the United States and we were going to bring a suit against them, then that's something that the Supreme Court would hear. They also have original jurisdiction, meaning they can hear the case the first time in cases in which a state is a party. So there was an example a few years back where California and Arizona were both involved in a lawsuit over control of the Colorado River. So obviously the Supreme Court would have to step in and hear that case. The Supreme Court has appellate jurisdiction, meaning cases that are heard on appeal. If a case is appealed from a lower federal court, the Supreme Court can hear that case. If a case is appealed from the highest state court, like if it went through, for example, the Missouri Supreme Court and a specific ruling was not appreciated by the people involved, then the Supreme Court could hear that case on appeal, but only if a federal law is involved. And the Supreme Court can also exercise judicial review, which would be a form of appellate jurisdiction. So just to make sure you remember, judicial review is the power of the court system to determine the constitutionality of acts of Congress or the president. Marbury v. Madison, what did it do? It established the principle of judicial review. Yeah. And hopefully you'll never forget that. So a few fun facts about the Supreme Court justices. There are 9 justices. Like I said, there are 8 associate justices and 1 chief justice. And that number was set by Congress. And that number can always be changed. So if Congress decides that it would be a great idea to add more justices to the Supreme Court, they can do that. All they have to do is decide and then pass that law. Now, FDR, during his second term, did attempt to what they call pack the court. So he attempted to add 6 new positions to the Supreme Court, and most likely so he could influence the court even after he was no longer in office. But we won't talk about that anymore. The salary of the Supreme Court. The justices, the associate justices, earn $213,900 per year, and the chief justice earns $223,500 a year. So they're paid pretty handsomely. They can be impeached and they can be removed from office. We've only had 1 justice be impeached, and we have never had anyone be removed. And the justices serve life terms. It almost sounds like a prison sentence, but justices do serve life terms. They are appointed by the president, and their appointment is then approved by the Senate. And that's pretty much it. The Supreme Court, constitutionally, there are no requirements to be a Supreme Court justice. Now, obviously, if the president's going to appoint you and the Senate is going to approve your nomination, you probably should have a pretty good judicial background, but that's not always the case. So some responsibilities of the justices. Just as is the case with the requirements for office, the responsibilities of the justices are not defined in the Constitution. Obviously, their main responsibility is to rule on federal law or on cases dealing with federal law. Over the course of our country's history, Supreme Court justices have taken on additional roles. For example, after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, a commission was established by Congress, and that commission was led by Chief Justice Warren. The Nuremberg trials, those dealing with the Nazis and after the fall of the Hitler regime, we had a Supreme Court justice who served on that commission, kind of like as another justice for that trial. So just because their main responsibility is to hear cases, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're just restricted to that responsibility. So I will stop there for today. We will pick up with more responsibilities of the justices next time.